A general rule for the video game and technology industry is that patterns tend to repeat themselves. With the previous generation of systems, both Sony as well as Microsoft released a mid-generation refresh, which begs the question, will we see history repeat itself here with both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox series of systems? Well, from what I'm hearing, the answer is a resounding yes, and we're going to be talking a lot about that in this very video, focusing predominantly on the PlayStation 5 Pro. But first, just a quick message from this video's sponsor. Did you just build a shiny new PC? Then you'll need a genuine copy of Windows 10 so you can personalize the system and of course get rid of that annoying activation watermark. We've partnered with WhoKeys to give you guys great discounts on Windows 10 keys, and of course they can be fully upgraded to Windows 11 too. You can get 30% off using the coupon code RGT during checkout. I've purchased several of these keys in the past using a personal non-RGT affiliated account, and they've worked flawlessly with quick delivery. If you want to pick up a copy of Windows for as little as $15 or a cheap and legit copy of Office, check the links out in the video description below. With the previous generation, Microsoft and Sony were very wise in how it allocated silicon budgets as well as production costs for its mid-generation upgrade. For example, the Xbox One X received a huge boost in GPU performance over the Xbox One, as well as various other enhancements. Now, let's quickly discuss what made this generation, the PS5, as well as the Xbox Series, such an upgrade over the previous generation, and then we can discuss where we're actually going to be seeing improvements with the PS5 Pro. As a general statement, the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X offer a generational leap in CPU performance, with the two companies utilizing variations of AMD's Zen 2 architecture, featuring 8 processor cores and 16 threads for both consoles. Not only do we have the leap in clock frequency, even over the Xbox One X, which ran at 2.3 GHz with its 8 processor cores, but both the Xbox One and PS4 used AMD's Jaguar architecture, which was based around an older x86 design, primarily envisioned for, say, tablets. Unfortunately, in terms of raw IPC, instructions per clock, Jaguar wasn't particularly strong, and perhaps was one of the biggest weak points of both last generation systems. The other big upgrade, one that was often talked about, particularly by Sony, was the SSD. It isn't just about faster loading from a game if you're starting it up or going into, say, a new area though. It allows developers to meaningfully create different experiences by having data stream so quickly from the drive to the RAM that your character could leave room A to room B, and by the time they've entered room B, data from room C, such as say textures and geometry, could have already filled up or started to fill up the console's memory. I've also done a more in-depth investigation of the console's SSDs and also Microsoft's Velocity architecture and direct storage as well, so those are separate videos. You can search for them on the channel if you would like. This brings us to the GPUs, which outside of their raw T-flops, which is a somewhat inaccurate representation of a generational performance improvement anyway, sees huge gains in features and a much more efficient architecture. Compared to the largely Polaris-based Xbox One X or PS4 Pro, these next-generation consoles are designed to shift graphics data at significantly improved rates. So then, there are a number of interesting things which have occurred recently. A few patents have emerged from Sony, along with a number of other things, but we'll discuss those in due course of the video. These hint at significant advancements, though, when it comes to the patents anyway, within PlayStation towards features such as ray tracing. From a previous video, I'd said that I'd been hearing that Sony were putting out a new PlayStation 5. It was indeed more powerful, and I'm growing more confident that this is the case. But, of course, with any rumour, it's important to realise that this information can be wrong. Projects can get cancelled in tech and gaming industry, and they do so with alarming regularity. But the PS5 Pro, to what I understand anyway, is allegedly real, and with some significant improvements over the base system. Speaking generally for a moment, last I heard, Sony had booked capacity at TSMC's 5nm in 2023, but I'm leaning more towards this being the PS5 Slim. Although it certainly could be both, my original source had told me that the capacity was for the Slim, but this was prior to my information concerning the PS5 Pro. Basically, they told me that Sony had booked the capacity, and then later on I learned that Sony were working on the PS5 Pro. With this said, historically, Sony have released the PS4, for example, in November 2013, then the PS4 Slim in September 2016, and then a couple of months later we saw the PS4 Pro. With the PS4 Pro, then codenamed Neo, it had been crafted on the TSMC 16nm process. This was a massive uptick in reduction of power and size over the 28nm used in the original unit. One source told me that they believe that the PlayStation 5 Pro is possibly targeting late 2023 or sometime in 2024. I've also had another person tell me 2024 as the time frame. Personally, I think just looking at historically what Microsoft and Sony have done with their respective upgrades the previous generation, this would make sense for a number of reasons. I think that going slightly later could possibly be more logical, because what they need to do, of course, is also make sure that the upgrade is worth it for you. For an upgrade to make any sense in terms of raw hardware, a few things need to come together. The first is that the yields of the silicon of the manufacturing process need to be good. Poor yields means fewer chips are produced, which reduces supply and of course increases the cost. But furthermore, they need this new production process to be a big enough jump. For example, again, we saw 28nm used for, say, the PS4, and then 16nm used for the PS4 Pro, which is a huge improvement. So not only does Sony need a new manufacturing process so that they can have the chip small enough and power efficient enough, but the yields need to be good enough as well. But outside of this, there needs to be an improvement in performance, a tangible, noticeable one. For example, Microsoft's Xbox One X provided a huge GPU upgrade, yes, but it also radically adjusted the memory system of the console. In essence here, we need a console which made sense to consumers, and actually developers as well. Remember, more consoles means more work. Now, if you're a first-party Sony studio, this is not so much of a big problem. You're dedicated to making Sony exclusives, so of course a new Last of Us, a new Gran Turismo, whatever. You're going to be working on the PS5 and the PS5 Pro, that's great. But multi-platform developers are working across different development teams across multiple different systems, and yeah, that can be a little trickier. Fortunately, a lot of games do receive PC ports, so that can benefit them in terms of like high resolution textures and ray tracing. We'll get more into that in a second. And with the likes of UE5, targeting different hardware specs isn't as tricky. For example, things like nanite, and you can reduce LODs, but even so, there is work to do with optimization. There could, however, be some time saved. For example, on the PS5 Pro version or an upgraded Xbox, artists could be more liberal with things like ray tracing effects. So yeah, this could reduce like fixed lighting pipelines and all that stuff, but you have to remember that a lot of this work is being done on the PC hardware anyway, because Nvidia have been pushing their ray tracing just insanely, and AMD cards are reasonably capable of ray tracing, and the next generation AMD cards are going to be absolutely ridiculous. So yeah. Before we get too much into the public information, which includes patents and other things, I'd also like to analyse what I'd personally been told. Again, this information is split across multiple different sources, and of course any of this information could be wrong, but here's what I'm told so far. Performance of the system is 2 times faster in standard raster, 2.5 in ray tracing over the vanilla PlayStation 5, possibly shipping in 2023 or 2024. Designed to provide an even better experience with PlayStation VR, uses advanced reconstruction techniques. I've mentioned previously in a video that this is not the same thing as AMD's FSR2, but seems to be based around Sony's research. I'm also getting conflicting info of whether the console can support FSR2. I imagine so, because typically speaking, AMD seems to let the software run across different things, like even FSR1 would work on the Switch. However, that is based upon my guess, that is not based upon what I'm told. It's likely using TSMC's 5nm process. However, I have had one source tell me this is not correct, and instead it's utilizing 4nm. We'll get more into the 4nm in a moment. Before analysing patents and public information, let's quickly go over what I've personally been told regarding the goals and performance of the PlayStation 5 Pro. Now, of course, this information could be inaccurate. However, several sources have told me variants of this information, and a couple of them have basically backed up what the other one has told me, and they have, to my knowledge anyway, nothing in common with how they would have procured this info. And I must say that the PlayStation 5 Pro is seeming to be a major uplift in performance over the base system, yes, but also it could be setting a precedent in how Sony wishes to pursue graphics in the future, with enhancements not only in the silicon, but also major improvements in efficiency with various new graphics techniques. There's a little public evidence, and I do stress a little, that there is new hardware being worked on by Sony. And there are multiple patents which are filed directly by Sony, with the inventor, among others, being Mark Cerny, who of course is the brainchild of the original PS5, along with other PlayStation systems. I know I told you guys I'd dive a lot further into this patent, as I've already covered some of this in my video from a few days ago, but this script is already getting pretty long, and if I was to go in depth into this patent, yeah, it's going to be like another 2 times video length. So what I will tell you though, speaking to several people to ensure I'm not crazy, this patent is not describing AMD's ray tracing implementation of RDNA 2. Essentially, Sony and Microsoft both use AMD's tech here, with a few tweaks here or there for the APIs on how things are done. AMD's current ray tracing implementation isn't as good, or to be more accurate anyway, as performant as Nvidia's. Essentially, it's less advanced and leads to a much greater performance hit when it's running. This is one of the reasons that both Microsoft and Sony's systems, they need to really pare back ray tracing or run at much lower resolutions. Although I will say, both Xbox and PlayStation developers have done a really good job so far, and I'm sure that there is still room left in the tank. Owners, though, of say an RTX 3080 will frequently use Nvidia's DLSS or Deep Learning Supersampling technology to increase frame rates, but even without DLSS enabled, the RTX 3080 will perform better than the RX 6800 XT. The two are roughly equal to one another if you're just utilizing raster graphics, just so you know. The RDNA 2 architecture, though, does feature hardware to accelerate ray tracing, of course, but while, say, ray and triangle intersect testing is performed using the GPU's texture mapping units on the Xbox Series X, the desktop, and Sony's PlayStation 5 as well. Oh, by the way, an Xbox Series S as well, just to be clear. The traversal handling itself isn't actually that advanced. The patent by Sony here, in a nutshell, explains a considerably more advanced, more efficient method. This patent doesn't exactly describe the performance improvement. Like, it doesn't say, well, now we expect a 75% improvement here and a 25% improvement there. It doesn't say that, but it does feature technology such as ray shortening. Basically, the very simplified explanation for this is that if you have a ray traveling, when it hits a solid object, it no longer travels. Basically, it stops. This is because light, and this is a highly technical thing I'm about to tell you guys, but light cannot pass through, say, a wall. So efficiency and raw performance should be much higher. Remember, I'd mentioned that the PS5 Pro was 2.5 times target for RT, but just 2 times in standard raster. Perhaps this is why the additional performance is this ray tracing improvement. Now, the obvious question is this from a future AMD IP, as I've already leaked numerous times, along with others, that Navi 31, 32 and 33 have drastically improved ray tracing. I've also leaked other things like the chiplet information of Navi 31 and other things as well. But it's also possible that this is Sony's own technology. Let's just be honest, guys, Sony are not exactly shy just coming up with their own thing, or for all we know, it could be a hybrid of both. I simply don't know at this stage. Previously, though, AMD did provide Sony and Microsoft upgraded graphics IPs for both of their respective bolstered hardware. Logically, we could expect similar here. Another thing, there's been a number of graphics presentations from within Sony of late, focusing on ray tracing reconstruction. I'll leave a link to the presentation in the description. Currently, it seems to be unlisted on YouTube. I've downloaded a copy or two. I don't know if they're going to remove it at any time soon, but yeah, I'll leave a link to it anyway. The presentation is relatively technical, but not too bad. Honestly, it falls again outside of the scope to go super in-depth with, but in essence here, it's to reconstruct the scene with fewer rays and lower resolution. During this presentation, we can see a few example screens. One of them is 8 rays per pixel being reconstructed, using very simplified language, to a similar quality of a ground truth image, which is made up of 2048 rays. That's quite an increase. While the presentation does focus predominantly on offline rendering, think movies like Pixar movies for example, they did show the PlayStation 5 in the background, and did specifically mention reconstruction and ray tracing is used in other things. Don't forget though, before Nvidia's DLSS was announced, Nvidia showed reconstruction on other stuff. DLSS uses a lower resolution image, say 1080p, to reconstruct to a higher resolution output, say 1440p or 4K. DLSS leverages machine learning and combines temporal information such as motion data. For simplicity, you can think of this as basically the past few frames so that DLSS can better guess where an object will be for the next frame, for example. But yes, before Turing, Nvidia's RTX 20 series of GeForce cards, Nvidia was showing this reconstruction for movers and images for upscaling. So perhaps this could be part of the information I previously received regarding Sony's own graphics reconstruction technology. Again, in a previous video, I mentioned that I had been told Sony had been working on its own graphics upsampling tech, not related to AMD's FSR2. I do believe that AMD are working on FSR2 as well, but it seems to be a totally separate thing. My guess, and I stress this is a guess, but call it an educated one, Sony are going to be using this reconstruction technology much like PlayStation 4 did with checkerboard rendering. I suspect that there is other upsampling as well as this ray tracing reconstruction, but yeah, the PS4 Pro sported significant hardware upgrades. Sony were less ambitious than Microsoft with the Xbox One hardware, which came a little later than the PS4 Pro. Without the SSD, the PS4 Pro, for example, really struggled with additional RAM. Microsoft added much more RAM to their system and Sony didn't. They used a kind of a DDR3 to offload some of the memory. It was a whole thing. And the second issue related to RAM, to my understanding anyway, memory bandwidth increases were kind of small, and so some developers, I believe, struggled with that. But what Sony did do is they actually used a slightly more advanced graphics IP. Although it was based on Polaris, they also utilized Vega as well. And, Mark Cerny spoke about this a lot during the presentation. And what they did is they took things from Vega, including rapid packed math. This allowed half precision operations, basically FP16 instructions on the GPU, and a few other tweaks, and this really helped push checkerboard rendering. So, of course, the Xbox One X had more raw horsepower, but Sony basically went in and used things like reconstruction quite a lot with the PS4 Pro. Continuing with my guesses, I expect Sony to double down on their own technology though, probably using improved expanding variants of things like their Geometry engine and Tempest engine, with a backbone still based around the raw essential ingredients of the PlayStation 5. For example, I don't think Sony are going to suddenly go, okay, well let's go with 16 CPU cores or anything extravagant. Because, again, they need to concern themselves with things like cost, production, and die sizes. Perhaps some IPC improvements to the CPU though, and probably also sporting higher clock frequencies. Sony and Microsoft both did the same thing with the previous generation, and honestly, I don't suspect that it's going to be too difficult. The rumour is that Zen 3 could be going up to like 5 to 5.5 gigahertz. AMD have already shown all the cores running at 5 gigahertz, and this is on TSMC's 5nm process. So I think, a 4 to 4.5 gigahertz PS5 Pro isn't out the realms of possibility, but this is a raw guess. That is not based upon any information. If they're using 5nm though, There's a lot of density and power improvements over the current 7nm. You can see a nice comparison here on AnandTech, so credit to them. If my 4nm info was right, and frankly I'm calling it a theory as I've only heard it from a single person, then we also get a small improvement in area and power reduction as well, as you can see according to this TSMC presentation. Ultimately, I want to stress I do not have a block diagram, the PlayStation 5 Pro. But with a more powerful GPU, the die would need to be still pretty big, relatively. There's been a number of patents from Sony in the past regarding dual GPU designs, but so far, at least the ones I've seen, maybe there's some more that have flew under my radar, so if there are some more modern ones, please reach out to me on Twitter, I'd be curious. The ones I've seen anyway appear to be more home, in like a server environment rather than in your PlayStation 5 in your living room. Closing out the video, there's also the question of the shipments that we've seen recently of new PlayStation hardware. Now, personally, I don't believe it's the PlayStation 5 Pro, because I believe at this point in the development cycle of the PS5 Pro, it would just be a little too early. I suspect that we would be looking at the bring-up stage of the APU. At the absolute best at this point, maybe some internal Sony development teams have approximations of the hardware, but most likely it's kind of in the stage where we saw the GitHub results leak from AMD. Do you remember where we saw like things like the Xbox Series GPU and all of this stuff, and it was very early revisions of the hardware where features were just not even implemented or working correctly. Clock frequencies weren't, even at the final speeds and all of this other stuff, because at that point, silicon hadn't exactly been cobbled together, let's just put it that way. So I suspect that if the PS5 Pro does exist, it's probably at that stage or maybe even earlier. Therefore, I imagine that those shipments, and unless someone who's working at one of these facilities who gets one of this or, whatever wants to disclose this, I don't think we're ever going to know. But I imagine it's much more likely to be something like PlayStation VR related. And other inevitable question, what about Microsoft? What are their plans for next generation hardware? Well, I don't think, Microsoft are going to be getting out the hardware race anytime soon. We've seen that the Xbox series of systems has done really well. In fact, even in Japan, it's selling better perhaps than many would have predicted. It's a little difficult to know exactly how things would have gone without shortages, but yeah, from what I understand, Microsoft are, and repeat, are testing new hardware internally. I don't know if they've settled on a direction. One of the sources that I spoke to about a month or two back, they basically told me pretty much that they were testing hardware, however, they have not settled exactly on the direction that they want to go. And it's implied, although I'm reading somewhat between the lines here, so I could be wrong, that they're not sure whether to release a mid-generation refresh or whether to go straight to like the next generation. Now, I believe at the moment it's probable that they will go with the mid-generation refresh. And personally, I suspect that Microsoft will probably do much the same as what they did with the Xbox One X, where the hardware came in later, which makes sense given they don't seem to be as far along in the development cycle. I suspect, therefore, that an upgraded Xbox console, let's just call it the Xbox Pro for lack of a better term, will probably be more powerful than the PS5 Pro, and it will probably come later. And this is just seemingly how Microsoft wants to kind of do things at the moment. I imagine, though, that Microsoft will, just continue to do what's working for them clearly. One of the real benefits, of course, of Microsoft's approach has certainly been backwards compatibility, and I think that it's not perfect. For example, there are still some Xbox original games which just haven't received backwards compatibility treatment, for example, but generally speaking, it's hard to deny that it's one of the strongest areas that Microsoft have really excelled in, the backwards compatibility, and I think that it's definitely worked a treat for them. And I imagine with future hardware generations, this is something that they're going to continue to double down on. It's going to be absolutely fascinating, to be honest with you, to see how the next couple of years go in graphics and gaming, because quite frankly with you, there's a lot of really cool technology, like reconstruction, that obviously we kind of touched on with Sony in this video, is becoming a really big thing. And now Intel are pushing XeSS, for example, which is essentially a competitor to DLSS, and it's going to be part and parcel of Intel's own discrete GPUs when they launch. I think that reconstruction and ray tracing is going to be kind of just holding hands, you know, the next generation. It's going to be really interesting too, as we start to leave behind the previous generation and new game engines are used. For example, Unreal Engine, when UE5 games start to ship consistently, it's going to be really cool to see what the PlayStation 5 and Xbox can really do with engines which are basically built from the ground up to take advantage of that hardware. Either way, I think that's just about it for this particular video. If you've enjoyed it, you know what to do. Of course, leave a likey on the video, and I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.